Hello, and welcome to the Real News Radio. This is your weekly broadcast where we discuss current events, politics, the lies and the deceit, the propaganda and the misinformation put forth by the corporate-owned puppet media. Today we start our War Powers Act series, our Constitution, A Search for the Truth. I've been looking forward to this. I put a lot of work into it. I hope that everyone will understand where we're coming from. If you have questions, feel free to email us on air at realnewsradio.com. Before we get into this series, I want to discuss with everyone a little bit of the information about how this came about, because it's really almost a series of miracles how we came involved with Dr. Gene Schroeder and got into this line of thinking, something that I had never really give a lot of thought to. I always thought something was wrong with the way the government could bypass the Constitution, like I've said before, have gun-free zones, a handgun bill in Washington, D.C. where you couldn't own a handgun for 32 years, several different ways that the Constitution's been subverted, where the president can rule by executive order and totally bypass the Congress. So the way this started, I had been doing some research into the Revolutionary War, found some facts that I thought was very interesting. The troops had, by many accounts, the British troops had not left until 1798. There's many accounts that we paid war reparations to England. I can't verify that as fact. I'm just saying this is what some historians say. Then the War of 1812, Britain comes back and attacks us again, supposedly after, they'd just been defeated. And that war lasted 3 years, and the biggest battle was fought after a truce was signed. So that war, it was, just a lot of things didn't make sense. Just doing research into American history. Then we get up to 1871, and we've got the Congressional Act of 1871 making Washington, D.C. a corporation. And a lot of information there that is not discussed in the history books. And was just doing research, found it very interesting. Bypassed 1913 because we've all covered the Federal Reserve, and got up to FDR and was looking into a lot of the things that he passed, the New Deal, run up on the Emergency Banking Act, where he made it illegal for American citizens to own gold. You had to turn in your gold. Now, the reports vary greatly. From my research, it only looks like maybe 25% of the American people were dumb enough to do this. And he also changed the currency. Before this, we had a currency that was backed by silver and gold. People were actually depositing silver and gold in the bank. You could go to the bank, take your paper money, and redeem it for silver and gold. They were silver and gold certificates. We have some of them. But he changed the currency and gave you the fiat Federal Reserve notes that you have today. So he changed the currency, he enacted all this legislation, and then if you look at the Farm Act bill, March 9, 1933, and go into some of what he said in his inauguration, you see that he actually suspended the Constitution. And in our Constitution, there's areas that give credence to this happening if we are opposed by a foreign foe, or if the emergency dictates that the scenario is great enough for the government to essentially suspend the Constitution. While I was doing this research, a gentleman came in the store, and I was discussing it with him, Mr. Wooten, and he said that he had a friend that had a videotape on the same subject, and I told him I'd like to have it. He brought it to me, and I watched it, and it was Dr. Gene Schroeder, who's going to be our guest on the 26th. With that, I watched the VHS tape, immediately turned it into a DVD and started passing it around, and I wanted to meet with Mr. Lambert. That is the gentleman, up in his 80s, the best I can tell, a very knowledgeable fellow. I met with him, discussed all this. He gave me a lot of information. He knew exactly what I was talking about. This was going on in the 90s, and like I've said before, leading up to this is suppressed information that I believe obviously is by design, that they don't want the American people to know about. Dr. Gene Schroeder, his exact words was, he beat his head on the wall all through the 90s, and no one has contacted him wanting to do interviews or even discuss this. His book only had one printing. At the same time, Mike, that is a listener that calls in, had a friend, Chris, who had a friend in Hickory, Rodney Miller, that had done a lot of study on this and had actually been involved with Dr. Gene Schroeder. The same day that I met Mr. Lambert, I also went to Hickory and met with Rodney Miller. Left there with about 300 pages of different information. Talked to Dr. Gene Schroeder while I was at his business, and told him that we were going to do a series on the War Powers Act. I wanted to bring it to light and to the listeners and to the American people's attention of exactly what has taken place here that no one ever delves into, that apparently the Constitution has effectively been legislated away. Now, with that in mind, I just wanted to let everyone know the series of events, which are, you can call it coincidence, you can call it divine intervention, you can call it whatever you want to, but it was a bizarre turn and twist that led us to this information. And like I say, I met with Mr. Lambert and Rodney Miller and spoke to Dr. Gene Schroeder all in the same day. So that is what led us into this research. Now, we're going to be going through this today, and we might say it sounds a little boring, whatever. We're going to be reading some congressional record. We're going to be reading what some congressmen said on the floor of the House. We're going to also be playing an excerpt of FDR's inauguration speech, March 4th, 1933, where he speaks volumes of what he intends to do. And that speech is on our website, therealnewsradio.com, and you can watch it in its entirety. It's well over 20 minutes, but we're only going to play 4 minutes of that. So to get started today, Brian, lead us off. We're gonna start with some congressional record from 1933. So we're taking you back now to 1933, and we're gonna bring this thing forward.
This is Congressman Beck. This is Congressman Beck speaking from the congressional record, and he states, "I think of all the damnable heresies that we've ever been suggested in connection with the Constitution, the doctrine of emergency is the worst. It means that when Congress declares an emergency, there is no Constitution. This means it's death. It is the very doctrine that the German Chancellor is invoking today in the dying hours of the paramilitary body of the German Republic, namely, that because of an emergency, it should grant to the German Chancellor absolute power to pass any law, even though the law contradicts the Constitution of the German Republic. Chancellor Hitler is at the least frank about it. We pay the Constitution lip service, but the result is the same." Congressman Beck is saying that, of all the damnable heresies that have ever existed, this doctrine of emergency has got to be the worst, because once Congress declares an emergency, there is no Constitution. He goes on to say, "But the Constitution of the United States, as a restraining influence in keeping the federal government within the carefully prescribed channels of power, is more bound, if not dead. We are witnessing its death agonies, for when this bill becomes law, if unhappily it becomes a law, there is no longer any workable Constitution to keep the Congress within the limits of its constitutional powers." What the bill is Congressman Beck talking about? In 1933, the House passed the Farm Bill by a vote of more than 3-1. Again, we see the doctrine of emergency. Once an emergency is declared, there is no Constitution. The cause and effect of the doctrine of emergency is the subject of this report. In 1973, in the Senate report, 93-549, the first sentence reads, "Since March 9th, 1933, the United States has been in a state of declared national emergency." Let's go back to Exhibit 9 just before this. What did it say? It says that if a national emergency is declared, there is no Constitution. Now let's return to Exhibit 10. Since March 9th of 1933, the United States has been, in fact, a state of declared national emergency.
Now, this vast range of powers taken together confer enough authority to rule the country without reference to normal constitutional processes. Under the powers delegated by these statutes, the President may seize property, organize and control the means of production, seize commodities, assign military forces abroad, institute martial law, seize and control all transportation and communication, regulate the operation of private enterprise, restrict travel, and in a plethora of particular ways control the lives of all American citizens. And this situation has continued uninterrupted